Welcome back, everybody. We're going to get started again, and we have several presentations this afternoon that we're real happy to share with you today. The first one is going to be given by my colleague, Vanessa Nuñez-López. And Vanessa is a research scientist at the Bureau of Economic Geology, which is part of our geosciences school, the Jackson School of Geosciences at UT Austin. It's the State Geological Survey of Texas, for those of you that might not be familiar with that. And Vanessa is going to talk about potential of CO2-EOR for near-term decarbonization.
So yeah, I'm going to talk about potential of CO2-EOR for near-term decarbonization. And I had planned on giving you a brief introduction. Is that I wasn't in the discussion this morning, so is this still necessary?
I think that would be good to do this, yes.
Okay, perfect. So let me start then with, going over some fundamental concepts. So CO2-EOR is an advanced oil recovery technology, right? It's usually applied after water flooding, at least here in the US, to extend the economic life of depleted oil fields. So when that is the case, the technology targets the residual oil that was left behind by water flooding by injection of CO2. When CO2 is introduced into the reservoir, several physical mechanisms enhance oil production. If the CO2 and the residual oil are miscible, which happens at pressures above the minimum miscibility pressure, then the CO2 starts to act like a solvent. It's kind of like cleaning, the rock in the similar way that, a solvent would clean your tools. But when that happens, the physical forces that hold the two phases apart, the CO2 and the oil, which is called the interfacial tension, will effectively actually disappear. And so they combine, forming a new phase. And this new phase will also expand, and its viscosity is going to be reduced, which improves mobility. So this enables the CO2 to displace the oil from the rock pores, pushing it towards a producing well or an extraction well. So because CO2-EOR is a displacement process, CO2 is injected into the deep subsurface through an injection well, right, that you can see here. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the slide. Can you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Yes. So it's injected through an injection well. Very commonly in the Permian Basin is injected alternatively with water, because the CO2, even though it is a gas and is injected in supercritical state, and so in supercritical state, it behaves more like a liquid than it behaves like a gas, but it's still very, very mobile, and it tends to, get ahead of anything and form fingers and break through early to a producing well. So to avoid that uneven displacement that will affect the performance of the flood, it is injected also with water. And so it produces a more uniform displacement front. So you can see here the CO2 alternating with water plugs, and that phase is displaced towards a producing well. And everything is going to get produced, not only the CO2, but now combined with reservoir fluids and the injected water, if it is a WAG case, water alternating gas that I described. It is produced, then it's going to be both separated by phases, so liquids and gases separate. And in the Permian Basin, it is very common to also process the produced gas, which is a mix of the CO2 and reservoir gases, so that CO2 is compressed and re-injected pure, or almost pure. In some cases, the operator might decide not to separate the gases, and so all that gas stream will be re-injected. That has, pros and cons economically and performance-wise. On the right side, you can see a photo, and this is one of our pilot tests. And this is just a site where some microseismic monitoring was being performed at an observation well. It's just for you to see, how clean a well pad is for the CO2 operations, or EOR operations. So CO2 with EOR with CO2 started in the early 1970s, in 1972 actually, in the Permian Basin, which is in West Texas and Southeast New Mexico, more specifically in a field called Sacroc. This region, the Permian Basin, is the third largest oil-producing region in the US. It has produced over 30 billion barrels of oil, out of which 1.3 billion barrels have been produced with CO2 through EOR. So what you see here is an example. The Denver unit is a very prominent example of CO2 EOR. It belongs to the Wasson field in the Permian Basin. The field started operations in 1938 by Occidental Petroleum. Production started, as you can see there, in the mid-1940s. Then the operator began pressure maintenance with secondary recovery, also water flooding, that started in 1965. You can see how the oil production curve responds to water injection. And then it starts producing obviously water again. Then it starts to deplete, and that's when the operator decides to start CO2 EOR. So the red is the CO2 injection, and you can see how production starts to improve and then stabilize. In the shaded green, you can see the incremental recovery through CO2 EOR, which was more than 120 million barrels through 2008. So most projects use natural CO2 that is produced from a natural CO2 accumulation, right? However, some projects have started using anthropogenic CO2. So let's talk about carbon capture and storage for a minute, CCS. So it is a technology where carbon emissions are captured. It means like separated, right, from a point source, a refinery, power generation, cement, etc. And then are transported and injected deep underground into a safe, permitted geologic site for a very, very long time. When CO2 is stored, when captured CO2 is stored through CO2 EOR, it enters into a category called carbon capture utilization and storage, CCUS, because the captured CO2 is being utilized for a commercial activity. In this case, of course, EOR, and then throughout the process of EOR, because of reservoir retention, capillarity, and other storing mechanisms, it becomes ultimately stored. So there's a few large-scale CCUS projects that are operational today. Let's start talking about the Weyburn-Midale project. It's basically an EOR operation, but that had a very large, first-of-its-kind research program attached to it. And the research program associated to the Weyburn-Midale EOR operation is called the IAGAG, Weyburn-Midale CO2 Monitoring and Storage Project. So it is located, the rest of the field is located in Saskatchewan, Canada. It started CO2 injection in October 2000, and it still continues to produce from both the Weyburn and the Midale oil fields at a rate of 14,000 barrels of oil per day. The CO2 injected is captured at a lignite fire synfuels plant in Beulah, here you can see in North Dakota. And it is transported to the fields via a 320-kilometer long transnational pipeline. So I think a lot of effort was put into making this a transnational operation. On the right, you can see the production curves. You can see the primary plus water flooding in yellow here. And then you can see some other operational activities that increased production until CO2 was injected. And so here in the gray shade, you can see the incremental recovery due to CO2-EOR at Weyburn. Another CCUS commercial application is here in the United States, southwest of Houston. And this is the largest post-combustion carbon capture project that has ever been installed on an existing coal-fueled power plant. So for this project, we actually designed and executed the monitoring, verification, and accounting plan, and we reported the mass of CO2 stored to the Department of Energy. It is a 50-50 joint venture between NRG, which operates the power plant, JX Nippon, which is a Japanese operator, and the captured CO2 is being injected into a nearby oil field called West Ranch, operated by, what's the name of the operator?
Hillcorp.
Hillcorp. How can I forget? Well, they received a lot of money from the Department of Energy to build the capture facility at the power plant, $167 million from the Clean Coal Power Initiative program. And it captured 90% of a 240 megawatt slipstream of flue gas. And it started sequestering about 1.5 million tons of CO2 per year since 2017. And I'm gonna go over this a little later. So we designed the monitoring program, and we successfully monitored the CO2 geologic permanence through the operation. And we applied a variety of monitoring techniques and tools and deployed those tools to observe the CO2 in the subsurface and basically just make sure they didn't leave a predefined subsurface volume, either laterally, as you can see here, or vertically. And for the mass accounting program, we installed flow meters in all these locations throughout the oil field. And this is what we reported to the DOE. Here you can see the CO2 mass. And in these curves, you can see the cumulative CO2 stored that is kind of like behind the CO2 purchase, because it's basically the CO2 purchase minus any losses, as I said, in the subsurface or at the surface, any leaks at the surface. And here you can see the CO2 recycle, the cumulative CO2 recycle. So recycling is very large. By the end of 2019, about 55% of the total CO2 injected into the West Ranch oil field was recycled CO2. And all the losses that we measured at the surface, and those include, you know, any troubleshooting, anything that might have happened that required a CO2 release, as well as just regular CO2 releases through flaring, etc., amounted to 0.91% of the purchased CO2. So let's start with the carbon life cycle analysis. So part of the discussion of whether CCS will contribute or CCUS will contribute enough to meet, you know, climate targets is a discussion around the role of CO2-EOR, right? The question being, can the oil produced through the process of CO2-EOR be carbon negative? So net carbon negative is a concept that, that was the subject of a study that I conducted that was funded by the Department of Energy and ETL. And so net carbon negative oil is oil that has a negative carbon footprint. A negative carbon footprint in this context is achieved when the mass of carbon that is stored through the EOR process is larger than the mass of carbon emitted to the atmosphere throughout the process, right? Within a very specific system boundary. So the boundaries of the carbon storage parts are better defined and more consistent throughout the literature. But the boundaries of the carbon emitted, though, not as consistent. So here's what we want to see, whether the mass of carbon emitted throughout the process of the CCUS system, which is the CO2 capture facility, the CO2-EOR site, right, the oil field, and the refining and burning of the oil that got produced through EOR. Whether those emissions are larger or not than the carbon that got stored within the oil field through the process of EOR. So we conducted, the methodology for my study was we conducted a scenario analysis that captured the range of CO2-EOR efficiencies to different CO2 injection strategies. And we modeled the reservoir responses, the responses being given in terms of how much CO2 was needed to produce 1 barrel of oil, which is something we call CO2 utilization rate. And we also built a surface model, which estimated the greenhouse gas emissions for a very specific system boundary. And then we coupled those two models. For the subsurface model, and I don't want to go too deep into that, we selected Cranfield as we were very familiar with the field. It was part of one of our flagship monitoring programs that we conducted. And it's a field that is actually very deep, 10,000 feet deep. It's a clastic reservoir that is a very nice, like, textbook apex of an anticline. The reservoir produced mostly oil with some gas from a gas cap in the 1940s and 1950s, and then it remained inactive until 2007 when the current owner, Denbury Resources, started EOR operations. So we used a compositional package to simulate the CO2 injection and to account for the fluid composition changes that occur in solvent displacement, such as this one. For the solubility, we used Henry's law, and the model was PVT tuned and history matched, etc. But the most important part is that we modeled 2 CO2 injection scenarios, some novel, some are the ones that are the most common. So we model continuous gas injection, where CO2 is injected just continuously into the oil reservoir, and this is actually what happened at the field. And so that's what we history matched, the continuous gas injection. And we model, of course, water alternating gas, which is the most common injection strategy. And we model also water curtain injection, which where water is injected in the perimeter of the intended EOR surface area to make sure that the CO2 is contained within the specific subsurface volume. And then we model a hybrid scenario that is a water alternating gas within the CO2 injection with a water curtain in the perimeter. So for the carbon emissions accounting, we used a carbon life cycle analysis approach. There are a number of excellent carbon life cycle analysis of EOR in the literature. But then when you go over all these studies that you can see here, we're going to very, very rapidly realize that they are very difficult to compare. And that's because they all use different functional units and they all draw different system boundaries. And so there's a lot of confusion between oil produced, incremental oil produced, a lot of confusion between CO2 retention and storage. The assumptions they use is different on different aspects of the projects. And so as you go through those, you have to be, very, very cautious. So let's talk about a LCA, life cycle analysis. It's a process that assesses the environmental impact that occurs throughout a product's life cycle, from raw materials acquisition through production, use, final treatment, recycle, and disposal. And this process is actually standardized in ISO and encompasses 4 very distinctive phases. 1, the goal and the scope definition, an inventory analysis, an impact assessment, and an interpretation of results. So in LCA, the definition of boundaries is very important and is part of the goals and scope definition. So all the relevant CCUS boundaries is what you can see here on the slide. So we have a cradle-to-grave boundary that is an all-encompassing boundary. We left out geologic carbon sequestration, which is injection of CO2 into a saline aquifer, deeper saline aquifer. Actually, I included, and I'm gonna show you some results of that. And the construction of the facilities. So for the purpose of this LCA is going to be assessing the environmental impact during the operational stage of the project. So for, CO2-EOR operations vary from site to site. So we developed a methodology for the inventory part. So to inventory for direct and indirect CO2 emissions. And it follows kind of like a decision-making diagram that you can see there, covering most of the CO2-EOR configurations. So an important distinction that I wanted to make here is the distinction between emission types. So you have direct emissions that are those that are emitted directly into the atmosphere within that system boundary. And you have indirect emissions that are the emissions that are emitted to the atmosphere, but outside of the boundary. And normally is, from energy consumption within the boundary. So if you have, if all the power that you use within that boundary, if it's being supplied by a grid, the CO2 is being emitted at the power generation facility, which is usually going to be outside of the boundaries of the CCUS system. So let's start with the first boundary, which is basically just the EOR site, which is what we call the gate-to-gate boundary. So what we did is we tried to mimic as much as possible the Cranfield operation. So production wells were gas lifted with CO2 during the first 3 months of activity, to kind of like to kick off production. And then after 3 months, production was sustained just by the energy of the reservoir, and then maintained by the CO2 injection. The gases and the liquids were separated at the surface, and then all the gases were processed, meaning the CO2 was separated. And we actually, because this is a very energy intensive activity, the separation of the CO2 from all the other gases, we took into account several separation technologies that we'll see later. And then the CO2 was recycled back into the reservoir. With one case where it's not separated, actually. So these are the results. Here, we superimposed the cumulative carbon storage curve, which is what you can see in the gray line. So this is the carbon that is stored through the process of EOR for the 4 CO2 injection strategies: continuous gas injection, water curtain injection, water alternating gas, and a water curtain injection with a WAG inside of the water curtain. So in this case, the water curtain injection inside of this curtain is just a continuous gas injection. And the color curves are the emissions. And the different colors are the different separation technologies. So we have the black one is where the CO2 is not separated from other gases and just re-injected into the reservoir. The yellow one is using something that is called fractionation or refrigeration. They're different, but they're very similar in the emissions. They produce the same emissions. And so I bundled them together. And the green one is using a membrane, most usually an amine. And the blue is Ryan-Holmes separation. And so you can see that at the gate-to-gate, the CO2, at the gate-to-gate boundary, the CO2 store greatly surpasses the CO2 emissions. So the operation for this boundary is net carbon negative. Or the oil produced is net carbon negative. Now let's expand the system. So this is it illustrates the components that we included downstream of the CO2-EOR operation. So transportation to the petroleum refinery, and then the end product combustion. And so we assumed that the energy is 100% supplied by the local grid. So this is a field, Cranfield is in Mississippi. So the grid is this one, SRMB. We assumed a refinery emission factor, which is a national average, and an end product combustion emission factor, which you can see here. So downstream emissions are a function of oil production, right? So our functional unit is the barrel of oil produced. And we assumed a maximum transportation distance of 300 miles with an energy intensity for that transportation of 260 BTU per ton per mile. And so this is the carbon intensity. And you can see here in the total, in the grave-to-grave, the total carbon intensity is here. You can see the carbon intensity of the product combustion. You can see the carbon intensity at the CO2-EOR site and at the refinery, and you can see just the contribution of those through time. You can see here that the product combustion is very significant at the beginning and then kind of stabilizes in all our scenarios. So here, you can see the gate-to-grave results. So that the curves obtained with our surface model are superimposed again on the carbon storage curves, just to observe the relationship and mainly identify the point at which the storage and emission curves cross. And we're going to call that a transition point. So before that, this gate-to-grave, the gate-to-grave system operates with a negative carbon footprint. And when those curves cross, the system starts operating with a positive carbon footprint, which means that more, so in the negative means that more CO2 is being stored than is being emitted into the atmosphere. And it also means that for as long as the carbon balance is negative, the oil produced is net carbon negative, and the system operates with a negative carbon footprint. So I think the main takeaway of these slides is that all our 4 scenarios start operating with a negative carbon footprint, as you can see here. And at some point, transition into operating with a positive carbon footprint. So here are some important decision-making parameters at this transition point, such as cumulative oil production, cumulative carbon storage, the length of the negative carbon footprint, and you can see I have highlighted here in red which CO2 injection strategy is best for all these parameters at the transition point. And you see that WAG kind of like click most of the marks. And these are the results in a gate-to-grave, but with stacked storage. So we have been strong advocates for what we call stacked storage, where you take advantage of the subsurface. And so you inject CO2 into an oil reservoir, but you also inject CO2 into an underlying saline aquifer for maximizing the CO2 storage, which is, you know, in case, for example, an operator wants to claim credits for storage and sees a value, an economic value of storing CO2, not only an environmental value of storing CO2. And so in this case, where the excess CO2 is injected into an underlying saline aquifer, when the amount of CO2 recycled surpasses the volume that is intended to be injected into the oil field, which happens, normally that CO2 goes to a different CO2 injection pattern or a different CO2-EOR operation even. But if you don't send that excess CO2 to a different field and instead injected underlying in a saline aquifer deeper than the oil reservoir, then this is the result of an LCA. So it greatly improves the environmental component of the CO2-EOR operation. And you can see that, for example, in CGI, most of the operation produces net carbon negative oil. Same with WAG. Like it extends the life of the negative carbon balance, which is beneficial for the environment. And this is a final system expansion where we included all the elements upstream of the CO2-EOR operation. So those emissions were added to the gate-to-grave emissions and account now also for extracting, processing, and transporting the primary energy that is combusted at the power plant where the CO2 is going to be captured and supplied to the EOR site. So in this study, we assessed the impact of two different anthropogenic sources, actually. We included a pulverized coal-fired power plant, a PC, and a natural gas combined cycle power plant, both with enough capacity to supply all the new CO2 required for a CO2-EOR site. We used just amine absorbers to capture the CO2 in this case. So I wanted to talk about a complexity of expanding the system and having a cradle-to-grave system because the product upstream of the CO2 site is electricity and not oil. So oil cannot be, or most of the LCL you see that don't use oil as the functional unit. So to solve this problem of the functional unit, we estimated the energy generation required to supply the CO2 needed at the CO2-EOR site, and then the greenhouse gas emissions associated with this energy generation, we related it to the barrels of oil produced. And that's how we kind of solve the problem of the functional unit. So I'm just going to go quickly. So I said that we selected two types of capture plants, a supercritical pulverized coal power plant and a natural gas combined cycle. And so we used emission factors for the coal mining and transport of this pulverized coal, right? And the CO2 emission factor for the natural gas production, its transport and its process. And here you can see some parameters that we used for estimating the CO2 emissions upstream of the CO2-EOR. And here you can see our Cradle-to-Grave results. For the case of the pulverized coal power plant, just for the sake of time, I'm just only going to show you this. So in general, you know, expanding the system to be all-encompassing is going to have an adverse impact on the carbon life cycle and carbon balance of CCUS. So the transition point here, you see, is displaced. I'm actually showing different curves, and here this curves actually shows the carbon balance. So as long as it is negative, you're operating under a negative carbon balance, which means the oil produced is net carbon negative. And then this is the transition point, and the operation starts to become net carbon positive. And so this transition point got displaced significantly to the left by expanding the system. But what we have to consider when we expand the system is electricity displacement, which means, so if the capture facility displaces a conventional power source and then credits are added for this displacement, then this adverse impact that was caused by this system expansion is not only reversed, but then transformed into a significant environmental benefit. So the effect of this displacement, you know, kind of more than compensates the emissions that are associated. And I think it's a very reasonable assumption to account for the electricity displacement from a conventional power source. So you know, as in all previous carbon balance curves, you know, here in the results, the balance reaches an optimum point here, you know, when you store the most. And then, you know, it's only after it starts to decrease again. Here you can see that WAG, the two WAG scenarios perform very well. Oh, sorry. They remain producing net carbon negative oil throughout the entire life of the operation, including electricity displacement for sure. So what are the impacts and what we found that was key? So our LCA is dynamic. And what that means is that we understand that it varies. The carbon balance of an EOR operation varies significantly with time. And what you would see in all studies is that will tell you an end point. And so what is the carbon balance at the end of the operation? And that's just not telling you the whole story. You have to have the history of that carbon balance to understand it and to be able to adapt and change the operation so that if it is of value for the operator to keep it operating under a negative carbon footprint, it can engineer the operation so that it lasts longer. And for that, you need a dynamic assessment of reservoir performance coupled with the energy consumption. And so we obtained results that show that in our Cranfield case, all CO2-EOR injection strategies start producing net carbon negative oil and then transition. And this transition point, again, can be engineered by changing the CO2 injection strategies, by understanding the interplay between how much CO2 you need to inject and how much oil is produced in the different strategies. We also saw that the environmental performance can be significantly improved in a stacked storage scenario with excess CO2 being injected into an underlying saline aquifer. The NCNO period, which is the one that has the beneficial implications for carbon credits or tax deduction, as I said, can be engineered to last longer. If electricity displacement occurs, then Cradle-to-Grave system has the potential producing NCNO as well throughout the life of the operation. And I guess, you know, most of all, our study just validated CO2-EOR as a greenhouse gas emission reduction technology. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Vanessa. I'm going to pass it over to Margaret Ash to assist with any questions, and she may have something to kick off.
Vanessa, thanks for that talk. It's exciting to know that oil and gas, and especially enhanced oil recovery, can be part of a decarbonization, because it's definitely a concept that's moving forward very fast. While we're waiting maybe for questions from other people, I do have one question. In that final model, you use some naturally occurring carbon dioxide as a source, and you said you modeled emissions into that, but I'm wondering if you captured the potential for significant emissions during well completion operations. But in southwestern Colorado, there's two fields, Doe Canyon and the McElmo Dome. The carbon dioxide's liquid in the formation. It's pretty wet. It's got some other impurities. And during their what they call productivity testing, but it's really just a sort of a well cleanup, is they vent carbon dioxide to the atmosphere for days at a time, sometimes millions of cubic feet of gas. So I'm just wondering if those things are in that model. Are they insignificant and don't need to be included? Or maybe the completion techniques to be useful, these companies are going to have to change their completion techniques a little bit?
Yeah, well, you know, let's talk about the magnitude for a little bit to have a perspective of how much CO2 that is. So you mentioned that they emit in the millions of cubic feet? No.
Well, I'm familiar with one well where we had some safety problems because carbon dioxide clouds were forming along the roads. People were driving through them, but there was 500 million cubic feet of gas from one of these wells.
Okay. So
now it is a one-time thing. You know, they clean them up and they gather and send them to treatment and whatnot.
So yeah, so to put things in perspective, you know, 1 metric ton is about 19,000 cubic feet. So 1 million cubic feet is about only 50 metric tons. And so, for example, at West Ranch, you know, which is the oil reservoir that CO2 captured from the Parish Power Plant for the Petra project that I talked about, the daily injection at West Ranch for EOR is 15,000 metric tons. So when you account for all that, those kind of volumes, even though they sound large, they're not in terms of the magnitude of the operation and in terms of the magnitude of the CO2 that is being emitted, you know, at a power plant, for example, and the potential for storing. So you're storing a lot more than was incidentally vented or associated with those wells.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
Good to know. Yeah. Yes, it does make sense.